Hi everyone, I'm Logan Williams, and I'd like to welcome all of you to this event discussing Lenin Lives, the Struggle for Socialism 100 Years On. Today's forum is the first of our brand new and monthly Lenin 100 in Britain series, which has seen hundreds of you already register for talks, including today on Lenin and Ireland, Lenin as an economist, and more beside, including his view on international questions, which I'm sure many of us involved in lots of the international demonstrations at the moment is a key part of the actions of the left. And before we really get into it, and before we hear from our main speaker, who is fantastic, and I'm very eager to be looking forward to hearing from him, Matt from the Lenin 100 volunteer team is just going to say a few words about why we're organising this series and how you can show your support going forwards. Thank you, Matt.
Thank you, Logan, and thank you to the people volunteering on this new initiative for asking me to be involved and to speak at the next event on theories of imperialism. I won't take much time, but I'm just going to quickly run through how it sort of looks in terms of format for each one and in terms of the series as a whole. And there'll be links posted in the YouTube that will help you with that. But basically, it's a monthly political education series starting today and running till December, and it will always be on the first Sunday of every month at 3 p.m. The next one that I just mentioned there, which the link will be posted that you can register for soon, is with Grace Blakely on theories of imperialism today. Then there's future sessions on Lenin as an economist, Lenin on Ireland, and other topics. Something that you can also do if you want to is buy a ticket for the whole series, which basically is a purely voluntary operation. Logan and others, great idea. But if you buy a ticket for the whole series, not only do you make sure you get the updates for each one, but also it does contribute to the sort of very basic costs of running streaming software, spending, setting up the Eventbrite. You can register for each one and so on. So please do consider that. Those links should be in the chat for the Grace event and for buying a ticket. And the other thing is obviously it's people from UK, around the UK and internationally on the chat. So please, as well as asking questions, please also tell us where you're from. I see already we've got someone from South Africa, someone from France, and someone from Worthing in the chat, for example. So please do post your chat there. And just a big thanks to Paul for kicking off the series and Logan and the volunteers for coming up with this interesting new initiative. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt, and those kind words there as well. So yeah, please do support us however you can, whether that's donating if you can, or whether that's just sharing or retweeting our pages, especially on Twitter, and sharing the Eventbrite links. That would be fantastic. So today's discussion on Lenin Lives, the Struggle for Socialism 100 Years On is a particularly timely discussion on a world that faces many crises. I'm sure our speaker, the fantastic Paula Blanc, will go into much more detail. Lenin was one of the most brilliant minds and organisers ever drawn into the international socialist movement, an outstanding theorist and a political activist. In this series, we aim to try and have a look at Lenin's dynamic revolutionary thought, how he worked as part of a collective at all times, how he centers the labour movement, and his radical understanding of democracy, and how his thinking, even today, can help transform our activism as we go forwards. So we're going to be having a look in particular today at the relevance of his ideas at a time of permanent war and it seems permanent economic crisis, and why there is so much we can learn from Lenin. So we just actually formally introduce you to our speaker today. We're to discuss this today. We're joined by Paula Blanc, author of many works on Lenin. I've got, I think, near enough all of them on my bookshelf downstairs, and they're well thumbed through pages, including the widely acclaimed Lenin Responding to Catastrophe, Forging Revolution, which has just been published by the fantastic Pluto Press in September, which was an excellent update, I think, on Lenin and Paul's plethora of works on him and bringing him even forward into our age. So it's really exciting that we've got Paul joining us today. And we want to have as many questions and comments from the audience as possible so that we can try and hear and develop our own thinking as well as your guys as well. And we've got volunteers who are going to be facilitating this through the chat function on YouTube. So please both post your questions. And as Matt said, please let us know where you're tuning in from. It's great to hear that we've got a couple of international guests already and telling us where they're from, as well as somebody from Worthing as well, which is fantastic. So we're going to hopefully have time for a few rounds of questions. So please, nothing from the most introductory question. So I'm sure in a question of nuance, I'm sure Paul will be able to help us understand a little bit more. So just a little bit of reminder, please, if you can, please donate to the link provided to our friends at Rise Festival who have kindly lent us their YouTube channel today. And most importantly, buy a ticket if you can for the whole of the Lenin 100 series to help us cover these costs, and so that we can keep this series running and so that we can keep it going as we go forward. So without any further ado, it's my great honour to introduce the ever fantastic Paul LeBlanc. Paul.
Thank you very much for that lovely introduction. It is an immense pleasure to be with you today to discuss this. And actually, I've been involved with this particular presentation in discussions with comrades in various countries. There was one in Dublin, there was one in Boston, there was one in Istanbul. And with all of them, I presented some variation of this talk. And the actual title of this talk that I've given is, "What would Lenin do?" What would Lenin do facing what we're facing? So let me begin the talk, and then we'll go forward to the discussion. Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, known by his revolutionary alias Lenin, is a central figure in the history of the 20th century. He was a leader of the Russian Revolution and a founder of the modern communist movement, who has been perceived by millions of people either as evil incarnate or as a benevolent genius. I would argue that he should be seen as a human being who can be shown to have made more than one serious mistake. But as Lenin himself noted, he who never does anything never makes mistakes, and Lenin did quite a lot. His development of Marxism's revolutionary cutting edge has relevance for the future. I want to focus on some ways in which revolutionary activists can make use of his ideas today. The great African-American poet Langston Hughes expressed his global impact in these lines. "Lenin walks around the world. Black, brown, and white receive him. Language is no barrier. The strangest tongues believe him." If we do it right, we can draw useful notions from what this comrade has to offer as we face such realities as anti-racist upsurges, the multifaceted escalation of feminist struggles, the immense challenges of climate change, wars in Gaza and Ukraine and elsewhere. In the United States, we have also been faced with the interrelated phenomena related to mild socialist Bernie Sanders and super capitalist Donald Trump. Rightward veering Trumpism poses an especially ominous threat, one that dovetails with the ascent of right-wing authoritarians around the world, such as Milei in Argentina, until recently Bolsonaro in Brazil, Orban in Hungary, Modi in India, Putin in Russia, Erdogan in Turkey. I will focus on US electoral realities later in this presentation because I am most familiar with them. In the face of such stuff, what would Lenin do? To deal with this question adequately, I think it will help to broaden it. Is it possible for us to make use of Lenin's ideas 100 years after his death? And if so, how? Another way of posing this question would be to ask, what would be Lenin's approach to using Lenin's basic orientation 100 years after his death? All the specifics of Lenin's analyses cannot simply be assumed to be applicable in the very different context of our time. At the heart of Lenin's political approach is the notion that While the use of Marxist theory is essential for building revolutionary movements and struggles, it must not be used as a dogma, but as a guide to action. Related to this is the dialectical notion that nothing is constant but change. Essential to Lenin's dialectics is also a recognition that continuities are blended intimately into the changes. Another essential element in Lenin's orientation involved the non-dogmatic utilization of historical materialism, which helps us see three realities, among others, three realities. One, economic development is central to the development of history. Two, the incredibly dynamic capitalist system is the dominant form of economy in modern times. And three, class divisions are decisive, and under capitalism, a small minority of capitalists and businessmen secure immense wealth and power by exploiting the labor of and squeezing wealth out of the lives and labors of the great majority of people who make up the working class. Despite multiple changes, for example, in the size and nature of the working class, which is bigger and more occupationally diverse than it used to be. And for example, in the structures and technologies associated with today's capitalist system as a whole, the underlying dynamics of capitalism remain similar from Lenin's time to ours. The 3 points I identified as part of historical materialism manifest themselves differently than was the case 100 years ago. But nonetheless, they continue to operate and to shape the reality of our own world. Two essential elements were constant in Lenin's approach. One was not to settle for simplistic and comforting dogmas, but instead to approach everything with a critical mind, to base one's understanding on what he called stubborn facts, seeking real information, with the drive to keep learning and learning and learning about the complexities of reality. A second essential element involved a refusal to settle for Marxist analysis as simply a passive contemplation of what and how things are. Lenin refused to detach social, economic, and political analysis from an activist engagement, from the restless and insistent question, what is to be done? For Lenin, from the time he became a young Marxist activist down to the end of his life, this added up to an insistence that we must not bow to the oppressive and exploitative powers that be, and that we must never submit to the transitory realism of mainstream politics. Instead, all political action should be measured by how it would help build the working class consciousness, the mass workers' movement, and the revolutionary organization that will be necessary to overturn capitalism and lead to a socialist future. At this point, we must emphasize something that should be obvious, but which many would-be Leninists lose sight of. In Lenin's time, throughout the capitalist world, there were powerful and influential socialist workers' movements influenced by revolutionary Marxist ideas that were more or less predominant among millions of working class people in their workplaces and communities and political life. Developments of the 20th century, often insidious, often horrifically violent, have undermined this reality and pounded it to rubble. The mass workers' consciousness and movements and the influential revolutionary organizations have persisted only as faded fragments where once they were powerful. For those remaining committed to Lenin's basic approach, this lends an urgency to the notion that all political action should be measured by how it would help rebuild what has largely been lost. To what extent is it still useful or relevant to retain Lenin's and Karl Marx's and Rosa Luxemburg's old focus on the working class. I continued to be influenced by the kinds of points C.L.R. James made in the early 1960s, when this question arose within his own organization in the United States. James explained the context in terms that seem incredibly similar to what we are facing now. He said, large sections of the American population are horrified and revolted at the rapid degeneration of American society. He continued, the sense of crisis is national and has attained such a scope that one cannot see how the American bourgeoisie will be able to handle it. It seems to me James's next point has greater resonance than ever. Whatever form a solution or the beginning of an attempt at a solution will take, it seems fairly obvious that for the first time, the American working class will have to assume, will be forced to assume, national responsibility, think its own independent thoughts, carry out its own independent actions. James concluded, it is to me certain that if the American working class should find itself, not necessarily at the very start, but rapidly enough, forced to intervene independently in the task of national regeneration, that one of the first things it will do is to reorganize the process of production, if it will act at all. And either it will act or the degeneration of American society and world society will continue. Some of James's comrades split from him on this, moving in the direction of what later assumed the labels of identity politics. Shifting class to the margins of their analyses, they gave pride of place to such identities as race, gender, and age. Over the last few decades, the counterposition of class versus identity has absorbed much energy and attention. But I am influenced by the blending of the two by my mentor, George Brightman, a seasoned working class intellectual at the end of the 1960s. This is how he put it. The radicalization of the worker can begin off the job as well as on. It can begin from the fact that the worker is a woman as well as a man, that the worker is Black or Chicano or a member of some other oppressed minority as well as white, that the worker is a father or a mother whose son can be drafted into the military, that the worker is young as well as middle-aged or about to retire. If we grasp the fact that the working class is stratified and divided in many ways, the capitalists prefer it that way, then we will be able to understand how the radicalization will develop among workers and how to intervene more effectively. Those who haven't already learned important lessons from the radicalization of oppressed minorities, youth, and women had better hurry up and learn them, because most of the people involved in these radicalizations are workers or come from working class families. If all this is true, then Lenin's basic political orientation continues to have relevance, which means that political action should be measured by how it helps rebuild mass working class consciousness and movements, as well as effective revolutionary organizations, bringing us back to the question of what would Lenin do in relation to developments and struggles of our time. I will focus on US realities with which I'm most familiar. Other parts of the world face their own specific realities, many of which overlap with what I will be touching on here. Some questions are less complex than others. Surely, it is crucial to support anti-racist struggles against police violence associated with the slogan Black Lives Matter, as well as an end to the US-funded slaughter in the state by the state of Israel of thousands of men, women, and children in Gaza. As masses of people are mobilized around such perspectives and find that their mass pressure can force decision makers to grant reforms, saving and improving lives, the result can be radicalizing in ways that advance the consciousness and self-confidence of significant components of the working class. There are, of course, super militant activists who scoff at reform because revolution is needed, insisting on more radical demands, which are understood only by the most radical of activists. The result is revolutionaries' self-isolation in much smaller and less unified protests. More than once, such super militant activists criticized Lenin as being far too tame and lame to embrace their self-isolating demands and tactics. This kind of division flared among Lenin's Bolsheviks after 1906, leading to a sharp and acrimonious split in 1909. Some preferred urban guerrilla warfare and revolutionary consciousness raising among socialist activists, as opposed to the mass electoral and reform activity championed by Lenin. But here, as always, Lenin's measure of what made sense was not adopting the most revolutionary stance. Instead, the measure was what would actually help generate working class consciousness, expand the mass workers' movement, and enhance the experience and influence of the revolutionary organization. The organization of the super militant Bolsheviks soon disintegrated, while the Leninist Bolsheviks became a hegemonic force in the Russian workers' movement. In the same period, Lenin carried on a relentless struggle against a component of the Menshevik faction, tagged the Liquidators. These comrades wanted to focus on organizing for reforms by restricting themselves to legal activities allowed by the Tsarist autocracy. They were abandoning the original program of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party of overthrowing Tsarism through a democratic revolution. Lenin was in favor of fighting for reforms, but not through abandoning revolutionary commitments. This would not advance mass working class consciousness and movements, nor would it help build an effective revolutionary organization. How does this apply to political developments and realities in the United States today? In 2016, Bernie Sanders campaigned as an open socialist to be the Democratic Party's nominee for President of the United States. He directly challenged corporate capitalist control of the Democratic Party, calling for far-reaching social and economic reforms beneficial to the working class majority. Millions of people, including substantial layers of the working class, responded positively. Hundreds of thousands of young activists flocked to support the Sanders campaign, a large percentage of which swelled the membership of Democratic Socialists of America from several hundred to almost 100,000. A growing number of activists went on to run as open socialists on the Democratic Party ticket, some getting a significant percentage of the vote, and some even getting elected. The idea of socialism, defined variously but positively by millions of people, became part of the political mainstream. This was repeated in the Sanders presidential campaign of 2020. Sanders was denounced by some who saw themselves as far more revolutionary. These super militant activists, plus super militants who were not very active except on the internet, made rejection of Sanders into a measuring rod to separate those who were presumably true socialists and those who were phonies. It was evident that Sanders was not a revolutionary socialist, He pointed to Franklin D. Roosevelt's liberal capitalist New Deal of the 1930s as an example of socialism. Another problem was that there was no way to ensure accountability of most of the socialist candidates running as Democrats to any socialist program or constituency. More than this, the Democratic Party really was, as Nancy Pelosi and other party leaders emphasized more than once, a capitalist party that would not tolerate efforts to turn it into a socialist party. A challenging socialist moment truly existed in the Democratic Party, but its shelf life would clearly be quite limited. Either Sanders and others would be driven out of the party, or they would end up capitulating, being loyal to and doing the bidding of the pro-capitalist leadership of the Democratic Party. For key travelers on this socialist road through the Democratic Party, it is this second option that has been chosen. Even if Lenin found himself on this particular road, he would certainly now be urgently posing the question, what is to be done? This brings us to the question of Donald Trump, who is far from a typical conservative or reactionary Republican. He is a crook, a liar, a bigot, a bully, a self-promoting huckster, and an irresponsible authoritarian who is quite happy to encourage the growth of and to mobilize for his own purposes large-scale fascist movements that are crystallizing in the United States. Given the current balance of forces, both in 2020 and 2024, there may be only one possibility of actually stopping him: electing his Democratic Party rival, Joe Biden, or maybe a younger replacement. What would Lenin do? It seems to me he would continue to be guided by what guided him in the past, helping build the working class consciousness, the mass workers' movement, and the revolutionary organization that will be necessary to overturn capitalism and lead to a socialist future. I envision Lenin emphasizing 4 points. Point number 1, tell the truth. Both Trump and Biden, or Biden 2.0, favor the interests of the rich over the rest of us. They are our enemies, not our friends. To campaign for either means telling lies, something we must not do. Point number 2, at the same time, face the truth. Any left-wing political parties running candidates in this election are not serious alternatives in the 2024 elections. Despite their truly admirable intentions, they have no chance of winning or of advancing the interests of the working class. Point number 3, one may choose to consider pulling the lever, the voting lever in the voting booth, for Biden or Biden 2.0 in order to register most effectively popular opposition to the figure who presents a qualitatively greater evil, Donald Trump. But the Bidens themselves are part of the problem, not part of the solution. Trump has gained credibility because of the inevitable failures of political figures such as Biden. Point number 4, it makes sense to concentrate time, energy, resources on 2 things. A, working hard to advance real non-electoral struggles through which we can build victories and consciousness. B, in tandem with such struggles, carrying out socialist education and agitation, focusing on the mess we are in, how we got into this mess, and the pathway to get out, which means building independent social struggles and movements, plus creating our own working class political party. We must recognize that our own daunting task of creating a global mass socialist movement will have to occur in an era of catastrophe. The destabilization and unraveling of the global environment and a consequent wave of economic calamities and mass fatalities. In this, we are cursed by good fortune turning to bad fortune. Fortunately, a scientific consensus projects that climate change might still be halted, preventing our planet from being overwhelmed by cascading catastrophes. This will require dramatic, decisive, immediate action on a global scale. Unfortunately, the necessary changes will be too costly in the short run for the businesses and governments that make the decisions. So far, the necessary changes are not being implemented. Liberal politicians offer reassuring rhetoric, phony compromises, and inadequate policies. Fake populists on the extreme right deny the realities of climate change altogether, resorting to authoritarian, bigoted, and violent policies in response to ominous problems threatening our world. As increasing millions of the world's people are impacted by the cascading catastrophes, a mass disillusionment with the capitalist status quo is likely, with a deepening radicalization. In contrast to Lenin's time, we lack the mass labor and socialist movements in most countries where they existed in the early 20th century. We must create the mass movements we need, more or less from scratch. But how? I want to focus here on what strikes me as one of the key elements, one key element. Some analysts have urged what they call a Green New Deal. Some use different labels, a strategy for climate jobs or climate justice. In tackling the climate crisis, we can create hundreds of millions of good jobs around the world, invest in the most systematically excluded communities and nations, guarantee health care and child care, and much more. So says social critic Naomi Klein. She adds, the result of these transformations would be economies built both to protect and regenerate the planet's life support systems and to respect and sustain the people who depend on them. This transitional approach combines multiple goals: people before profit, decent homes and good communities for all, healthcare for all, education for all, mass transit and communication systems for all, nourishing food, access to cultural and recreational nourishment, creative outlets, genuine liberty and real justice for all. To the extent that we can build such struggles and such a movement, while expanding a deepening consciousness within the working class based on such experience, we are creating the conditions out of which it will become increasingly possible to build the kind of mass socialist workers' movement that we need. We can be open to building organizational coalitions and even class alliances around specific demands. But our struggle requires an elemental political independence from, not reliance upon, capitalist politicians. Our struggle must be based on the elemental needs of the working class, which are in collision with the drift and dynamics of capitalist profit-making. The logic of our struggle goes in the direction of increasing democratic working class control over the economic policies and developments of our world. To the extent that there is success in such efforts, combined with an understanding a consciousness of the meaning of and need for such struggles and victories. A force for an actual socialist revolution can be advanced. While I am convinced that struggles around climate change must increasingly become central to revolutionary socialist efforts in countries throughout the world, it is also absolutely true that there are a number of other struggles, some existing now and some that will flare up in the future, on which socialist activists will be compelled to focus attention and energy. In all cases, however, I think they will be well advised to utilize the Leninist approach outlined here. Stemming from today's conditions and from the consciousness of expanding layers of youth and the experiences of the laboring majority, it may be possible to build a fundamental challenge to the existing system of power and to create a better world. As we strive to advance that process, there is much to learn from the ideas, the insights, and the experiences of freedom fighters who went before. Lenin, with all of his accomplishments and insights, all of his mistakes and heroic efforts, is among the freedom fighters we should look to. That is my presentation, comrades, and I look forward to discussion today and beyond today. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, for that fantastic talk there. It was highly interesting. We've had quite a few questions so far, and obviously please keep those questions coming in. We'll try and get through as many as we can. But I just want to say that we've had over 160 viewers from a wide variety of places, such as Derbyshire, London, Paisley, Edinburgh, Worthing, Wales, North Norfolk, Ireland, the US, South Africa, France, and Botswana. So really an international call there, and a real drive for an international socialism, which I'm sure Lenin would be proud of. I want to start just by another quick plug before we go dive into the questions, just to give you a bit more time for those of you still thinking or writing of yours. Just to plug again, please, if you've enjoyed today, please donate if you can. Please buy a ticket if you can. Please sign up or register for our other talks as well, just so that you don't forget them. Remember, it's every first Sunday of every month until December now. So we're going to keep these events going on. So let's dive into these questions. And I'm going to start with David from YouTube's, which is sort of two, but they are linked. And it's, what is distinctive about Lenin's approach to dialectical thought and action? And is dialectic still a valuable and useful tool for revolutionary practice? So, and then for our second one, just so that we sort of group two together, Paul, if that's okay with you. Throughout your talk, you referred, and this is from an Arsenal fan in Islington, sorry. Throughout your talk, you referred to Lenin's centrality within his thought of building the consciousness of the working class. What can socialists today learn from Lenin's strategic approach to building unity through action, through either mass organizations like the labor movement and in united fronts with others on the left?
Can you repeat that last piece there?
So it's, what can socialists today learn from Lenin's strategic approach to building unity through action, through mass organizations like the labor movement and in united fronts with others on the left?
Okay. Let's see, what's distinctive to Lenin's dialectics? Actually, Lenin, more than most Marxists of his time, engaged with dialectical thinking in Marx, also in Hegel, at a certain point. He wrote a wonderful little introduction, an encyclopedia article that introduced Marx and Marxism, and it was unique in the emphasis. He started by talking about dialectics, and outlining various aspects of dialectical thought. And so I think one thing that's distinctive about Lenin's approach to dialectics was that he approached and emphasized dialectics, and this notion that things are changing all the time and they're contradictory, and they evolve through their contradictions, and we've got to pay attention to that, and that we must adapt to new realities, but understand that contained in the new realities are elements of the older realities, and that there are new possibilities that might be possible if we play our cards right. He emphasized that kind of stuff more than many other Marxists. And it's, I think it's still relevant. You know, why is it still relevant? Well, look around us, you know, I mean, things are a chaos, things are a mess, but at the same time, we can see certain kinds of patterns, and we have to look for those patterns that go back to the earlier realities and that create new possibilities and new opportunities. And what we do, our interplay with those realities can alter those realities. That's dialectical thinking and a dialectical approach. And I think that is still vibrant in our own time. And then how do we, what can we learn from Lenin in terms of building, you know, strategic orientation to develop the consciousness of the working class and so forth? In a way, my talk is focused on how can we learn from that. But one key is by doing, by engaging in activity. And we're going to screw up. We're going to make mistakes from which we will learn, and we'll build on the learning from those mistakes. It has to be real. What's his name? George Lukács, who wrote a wonderful little study in the 1920s of Lenin, the dynamics of his thought, emphasized this notion in Lenin of what Lukács called the actuality of revolution, and that could be misunderstood in various ways. There was another a US writer who at that time was very much drawn to Lenin. He later became more conservative, a guy named Max Eastman. And what he emphasized is Lenin had no patience for those who talked revolution but didn't mean business, who weren't really, you know, working to engage in bringing about a revolution. And in a way, that's the same kind of point that Lukács is making. So I think that that's a key. We need to take Lenin's ideas seriously, but then try to see in practice, in reality, how they can apply to our own realities, and then learn from that. And it's a collective process. It's not some two-legged genius named Lenin or Lenin 2.0 who will explain everything to us. It's a collective process among revolutionary activists. So we can learn that from Lenin, and we need to learn it, you know, ourselves as well.
Okay, fantastic. And if only there was a Lenin 2.0, I'm sure it would maybe help us all out a little bit. Okay, so for our next two then, yeah, the first one of which is a question actually from myself. For many of us who've grown up since the collapse of the Soviet Union, we often get confronted with the idea that communism is inherently undemocratic. It's the sort of Stalinist monolith. You know, it didn't work. It was all of this. Inherently undemocratic. No one had a voice. It was one man at a top. I was wondering if you could expand a little bit. I know, obviously, sort of like August Nimtz's work on the electoral work of Lenin, but if you could expand a little bit on the centrality and Lenin's fight for democracy, or some useful pointers for those of us who have to sort of confront that myth of the undemocratic communist state. And then our second one.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry there, Paul. Was I'm sure something that you'll be very interested in, which it's come up from your talk previously with the Arise Festival of Lenin in Luxembourg, and obviously that they often get juxtaposed as sort of the good Marxist of Luxembourg and the evil devil man of Lenin, sort of by the political centre and right wing, and whether they're actually, I'm sure I know your answer, but it's always great to hear it again, of whether there was actually this massive gap between Luxemburg and Lenin, or whether it was a difference in nuance rather than of actual difference in argument.
Sure. I think the collapse of the Soviet Union, the rise and evolution and collapse of the Soviet Union, it's essential for those of us who identify as Marxists and who identify with the Leninist tradition to wrestle with that and to engage with that and to explain it, be able to explain it in some way. And I've been attempting to do that over the years, including in my most recent book. I devote a lot of attention to that. And there was a wonderful series, a 4-month online extravaganza organized in the U.S. by a Cuban friend of mine and others called Leninist Days. 100 years since since Lenin's death, and 100 years of Lenin since his death, and so forth. And there were multiple speakers, including people wrestling with the kinds of issues that you've just raised. And the short answer is read my book. That is, I devote 2 or 3 chapters, major portions, 2 or 3 chapters in the book to that question. And there are other books and other studies by other people. Leon Trotsky's The Revolution Betrayed was an early and serious attempt. Victor Serge has written a lot about that kind of stuff, both fiction and nonfiction, of trying to come to to grips with it and to make sense of it. And Serge makes an important point, which is that so the seeds of Stalinism can be found in what the Bolsheviks were doing. That was one, and obviously that's how things evolved. But the seeds of other possibilities were also in what the Bolsheviks were doing. And people who fought, among the first who fought against Stalinism were Bolsheviks and Leninists. Lenin himself, he did it too late and inadequately, but he was fighting against that. And that's something a guy named Thomas Krausch wrote a big fat book on Lenin, in which he emphasizes also the democratic content. George Lukács, I've mentioned before, who towards the end of his life said, we've got to rip Stalinism apart because it is the opposite, is the enemy of Marxism and the Marxism that Lenin stood for and the goals that we're fighting for. But it has to be explained, it has to be understood, and we must build alternatives to that, learning the lessons from Lenin's mistakes, for example, and the mistakes of other Bolsheviks. But that doesn't mean throwing out the positive. We need that positive that they also contributed. And Lenin and Luxemburg is this cosmic morality play, the good guys and the bad guys, the good Marxists, the bad, which was alien to their way of seeing things. They were comrades. They liked each other and shared a lot of common ground, and had not simply nuances, they had some serious differences. Luxemburg's wonderful, complex book, The Accumulation of Capital, in which she discusses imperialism. It's a very different analysis of imperialism than Lenin's little, outline of imperialism. I think that Lenin gets it right in some ways that Luxemburg doesn't, but there are amazing things in Luxemburg's analysis that we can also use. Even when one is wrong, there are things that are worth looking at in what they're saying. And so as one of Lenin's and Luxemburg's comrades, a guy named August Thalheimer, who was along with Rosa Luxemburg, one of the founders of the German Communist Party. And then she died in 1919, but he continued and continued to, among other things, lead the fight against Stalin and Stalinism. And he was finally expelled from the communist movement, or the Stalinist movement. He remained a communist all of his life. And he argued it's not Lenin or Luxemburg, it's Lenin and Luxemburg. They're both comrades, and they're both essential to the kind of Marxism and to the kind of socialist revolutionary project that we must be committed to and we can learn from. So that is a long-winded but all too short response to that second question.
Yeah, I'm sure if comments do want to learn more, I'm sure if they have a watch back of that talk between yourself and Helen Scott, that was a bit more.
Helen and I, it just came out. Verso is publishing the complete works of Rosa Luxemburg. Volume 5 just came out, which includes Luxemburg's discussion of the Russian Revolution.
Okay.
And Helen and I have a lengthy introduction there where we come to grips with and try to analyze and unravel the complexities that are inherent in this question of Lenin and Luxemburg. Yeah.
Okay, so for comrades who are interested in exploring that debate, and as you say, that sort of almost cosmic soap opera of good Marxists versus bad Marxists, check that out then from the good comrades at Verso. And we've got one final question, and then that is, if you were to recommend 3 of Lenin's texts to somebody wanting to discover Marxism a little bit more, which 3 would you choose? Let's go why as well.
Well, let's see. There was a 3-volume selected works of Lenin, so those 3. That's a great question, but I think depending on what you're wrestling with, the 3 texts, the titles of the 3 texts would change. I mean, The State and Revolution is magnificent in a number of ways, and it's got, limitations at the same time. His imperialism is a major, it was a major innovation because it represented a kind of breakthrough. It's not that he was the foremost theorist on imperialism. There were others who preceded him, and he attempted to put it together in a certain way, but he made it central to the Marxist project, revolutionary project, in a way that helped to break Marxism out of the European focus, the Eurocentric focus, into Asia and Africa and Latin America and globally. So that's an important book. Left-wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. There are wonderful things in that book. There are really interesting things in what is to be done, although in some ways it's focused on a set of problems that are different from the problems that many of us are facing. But and then there was the split between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, and he's trying to make sense of it in 1 step forward, 2 steps back. That's I mean, I could go on and on and on. There's a book that I edited for Pluto that attempts to gather together what I see as some of the key writings. This is one version of it, and then they put it out as a left book club thing: Revolution, Democracy, Socialism, Selected Writings. And that might be one volume that has a number of pieces that give a sense of the whole Lenin, but it's limited also.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'd also recommend there your From Marx to Gramsci, which I think underpins all of it as well. whole plethora of other revolutionary thinkers as well. And unfortunately, we have run out of time there, but has been an absolute pleasure, Paul, as ever, to hear from you, to gain even more understanding of Lenin. I think every time I hear you speak, whether it's for Haymarket, whether it's for Pluto or whatever, I feel like I learned something new, which is always fantastic. And I'm sure that comrades on the call from around the world, from the African continent to the US to across Europe and Britain especially, I think this has been fantastic. It's been a great way to kick off the Lenin 100 series. So I hope that comrades agree and that they hopefully will continue to support our next one. To remember, as I say, a month today, first Sunday of August, we have our next speaker, which is fantastic, and it is going to be with Grace Blakely on imperialism and monopoly capitalism, which I think is a key issue that is facing to the left today. So I hope to see you all there. I hope that you've all bought your ticket or that you have registered already. And thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday. Thank you, Paul.
Bye-bye.
Bye.